O God, so speak through my words that your words may be heard, and being heard may be believed, and being believed may be lived. Amen. In 2017, Bishop Michael Curry came to speak at Washington University in St. Louis, where I was working in campus ministry. Some of you will certainly know Bishop Curry as the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, but more of you, I think, will remember him as the royal wedding preacher, the bishop who has become a go-to interviewee on morning shows and who taught us, if it's not about love, then it's not about God. In 2017, just a few months into the previous federal administration, WashU's Danforth Center for Religion and Politics had invited him to give a talk entitled Healing a House Divided. It focused on the need for all of us, red, blue, Republican, Democrat, black, white, whatever, to reach across aisles and find ways to honestly listen to and build relationships with people who were different from us. The house was packed, but the Episcopal campus ministry students had gotten to work the event and sit up front, and we hoped that from those seats we might have a chance of getting one or two of our students called on for Q&A. Unfortunately, the introduction and talk went long enough that there was no time for Q&A at the end, and as we walked back after the reception, one of my students, a young Black Latino man, said, "I really wish we'd had time for questions, because I really wanted to ask him what you're supposed to do when you're willing to listen and you're willing to try. But the person across the aisle from you will only do it on the condition of denying your full humanity." I told him, boy, I wish you'd had a chance to ask him that too, because I think he really would have had an answer. Not just a brush off answer in defense of his theory, but an answer developed out of real lived experience. A few months later, Bishop Curry came to preach at a gathering of young adult and campus ministry professionals, and he showed us his biblical math this time, but spoke largely about this same idea of how we heal a divided nation by building relationship across difference. So after the service, in the rush of selfie requests that follow him everywhere, I ran up to him and said, "I don't want a selfie. I want to bring you the question that one of my WashU students didn't get to ask you in April." And I asked, and he looked at me. And he looked at his staffer and said, "Pull me out 10 minutes before I have to go to the airport. I want to think about this one while I do the selfies." And they did, and he sat me down and he taught me more than I think I knew I could learn in 10 minutes. And one of the things that he said was, I think one answer is to hold together the sending of the disciples and the story of Nicodemus. Jesus tells the disciples to go into a place undefended, without a bag, without a budget, to stay wherever people are willing to engage, but not to get stuck trying to budge that one person who won't welcome you. His instruction was, if they don't want to engage, you give them that freedom. Shake it off and give yourself the freedom as well to go find some people who will engage. Not people who are already on board, people who already agree with you, but people where the work might bear some fruit in building that relationship. But then also, as we leave, he said, we leave the door open behind us for them to change their minds later. Because when Nicodemus came to Jesus by night, Jesus didn't say, "Buddy, you had your chance earlier." He sat with him at night and taught him as he was that night. And so if folks come back around and say, let's try this after all, you make room for them to repent and be received, and you give them that freedom as well. Shaking the dust off of their feet as they leave a town is often talked about as a curse on that town. But in this framework, it isn't at all. It's just a reminder that the gospel work of healing and teaching and building communities of God requires freedom for every person. That forced conversion is no conversion of heart, no matter what name it's given. And Jesus isn't interested in it. So if they aren't interested, move on, he says. There are plenty of other places to seek that relationship, to do that work. Liberation and freedom are major themes of God's story with us, from our freedom at creation to choose to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, to the message of liberation from slavery that is so predominant in Exodus, to the commandments given at Sinai for newly freed people not to chain themselves to constant work nor to kings of the earth, and not to enslave the foreigners living in their midst, to the message of liberation from sin and death that Jesus proclaimed and enacted, to the freedom implied in Revelation that even in the end, it will not be a force that forces heaven upon those who do not consent to it, even for heaven. Freedom is a core biblical value. And yet Christian freedom is a very different beast from a lot of what we might hear lauded in national proceedings this weekend. I've come to believe that for US Christians, an important part of faithfully celebrating Independence Day in this country is to reflect on how our national culture and history tend to conflate liberation and freedom with independence. Now, they are not unrelated. That's not to say one is good and one is bad, but because when we are bound or colonized, we are limited in ways that God never intended for us. And for that matter, when we hold others in bondage and oppression, we are limited in ways that God also never intended for us. God does not intend for any of God's people to be prevented from living fully, from living in ways that bear the fruit of the Spirit. We are meant to have our independence from structures that oppress and destroy, whether those are governmental or church structures or family systems or anything else. And so in this sense, freedom and independence are inextricably related, but they are not identical. Maybe more than anything else, the freedom that Christ brings us, the freedom that Paul talks about in Galatians when he says, "For freedom you have been set free," is the freedom to live in community with other people and with God. And this is somewhat contrary to our usual notion of freedom in this country. Our Western notion of freedom grows primarily out of individualism. Freedom for most of us in the Western world has to do with being totally unrestrained. We are free, we believe, when we don't have to consider anyone but ourselves. We are free when we get to decide that we'll get around to following Jesus after we've done everything else we wanted to do first. We are free when we don't have to think about consequences, free to be as selfish as we please. As a nation, we have largely decided that a focus on ourselves will free us from reliance on anyone else, and that has become our highest goal. We want to be wholly self-sufficient and thoroughly independent. And we find that the more we try, the more lonely, divided, unhealthy, and frustrated we become. In many ways, we become less truly free than ever. And this is where we find some of Jesus' harshest words. Not for those who refuse healing for themselves or who refuse to give honor to Jesus and his disciples, but for those who stand in the way of freedom and healing for others. We don't get to it in this reading. In this story, Jesus and his disciples are still able to heal many who are sick, regardless of whether the people around them want to join in. But elsewhere in the Gospels, when Jesus gets angry, it's generally because leaders and nations are using their own freedom to block others from getting free and being healed. As a nation and as churches, there is an important call for us here. The full truth of our history includes some lofty and holy goals of liberty and justice for all. It also includes a long history of purchasing an independent sort of freedom for some at the cost of liberty and justice for all. Both. Much of the wealth we have built as a nation, and especially for those of us who are white, what wealth we might have in our own family histories, was often acquired through withholding freedom from those who lived in this land first and those who were brought here to make it financially prosperous. even our most beloved national leaders and institutions, those we have good reason to love, from the founding fathers to the Episcopal Church, also have a complicated history in which we share in this regard, that we need to learn from if we want to be as free as our national goals say we can be, and certainly as free as God offers us to be. In recent weeks, particular attention has been drawn to the history of residential schools in Canada, where the government and churches forcibly separated First Nations parents from their children in order to teach them English and reinculturate them to be like white children, including forced conversion to Christianity. That history, which has always been a stain, has come alive again as hundreds of children's bodies have been unearthed at several of these schools in unmarked mass graves. To the extent that this story has been covered here, it might seem as though this were a uniquely Canadian phenomenon, and yet the US had 3 times as many residential schools as Canada, and the Episcopal Church had at least 18 of our own. The last of ours were closed recently enough that we are still hearing the direct stories of elders who were children in these schools themselves. And it is true that we have found no bodies of children at our schools in this church and in this country. It is also true that we have not begun to look, and that for decades there have been survivors who have told us what we should expect to find if we do dare to look. Now, thankfully, both the Executive Council of the Episcopal Church and the Department of the Interior of our government have taken up this history this week and committed to start researching. This is an unprecedented and important step, and also the easiest part of breaking free. Both our church and our government will need public support and pressure to keep going, not just to pursue enough truth to feel like we can shake off the critique, but to push through to find how we can make amends, how we can reach the stage where we are free to pursue honest relationship with the Native communities we have harmed by seeking their freedom and not just our own. This is what Christian freedom invites us to. It is a freedom that is not easy. It is first and foremost the freedom to move beyond a radical, distorted sort of independence to a healthy interdependence. It is the freedom to receive a love beyond our imagination and beyond our earning, and out of that belovedness, to spend our lives learning to love God and our neighbors with all that we have and all that we are. Christian freedom is the freedom to say yes to all that love offers and to be equipped for all that love asks. It is a freedom that we are offered. I wonder this morning, how were you taught to understand freedom or independence in school or at home or in the news? And what does freedom mean to you now? And to continue to reflect on this as we go about our week.